Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined again by Rachel Hoover Canto. Welcome back to the show, Rachel.
Thank you for having me again, Colleen. It's great to be back.
It's wonderful to have you here. I really enjoyed our first conversation, and it seemed like other people did too. It did very well. It spiked a little bit after you were on Lila Rose's show.
Yes, that was a wonderful adventure being on her show, and obviously HLI and Lila Rose are in alignment on the pro-life topic and everything. So that's great. I love seeing how much dating and preparation for marriage content kind of feeds into the pro-life movement, and if we don't have very many babies if we don't have very many marriages. So this is great.
Yeah, the chastity side of things and contraception and all of those kind of life and family topics. And yeah, that's definitely what I try to do on this show. So anyway, going into our topic today, we're going to be talking about chastity because you wrote an entire chapter of your book, Pretty Good Catholic, on chastity. And after our last episode, we were talking about how it would be good to do an entire episode just devoted to this topic. So maybe just start with what led you to put an entire chapter of your book on dating, on chastity, and what was your own experience like navigating what is chastity? How does it apply to relationships when you were dating?
Sure. So, anytime we talk about dating in the Catholic or Christian world, we have to talk about the whole issue of chastity, which is, to put it simply, it's the virtue of, um, I guess, the virtue in relation to sex and sexual desire. So, keeping that kind of in its right place and right proportion in our lives. And um, the Catholic Church and scripture and everything is very clear that that means sex itself is supposed to be safe for marriage. So, you could just put one sentence in a book and say sex is for marriage and don't do that when you're dating, the end. But there's so much more to it because it's not just a matter of kind of your outward actions. It's this virtue that's supposed to be formed internally. And if you just tell people just don't have sex until you're married, then it sort of brings up all these other questions. Well, okay, what if we don't actually do it, but we get kind of close? Is that still bad? I mean, okay, the answer is probably yes, depending on what you mean by close, right? And so there's a lot of questions. And ultimately, what a lot of young people ask, at least in my experience growing up, when I would hear some kind of mentor figure give a talk on chastity, the question everybody was always asking was just, how far is too far? We would hear the advice like, don't go too far with your boyfriend or girlfriend. And then we'd go, okay, what does that mean? Well, what's too far? We want to know. And the answer was always something kind of vague and something along the lines of, well, that's kind of the wrong question, because if you're asking how far is too far, then that means you're already trying to push the limit. You shouldn't be trying to kind of go as far as possible. You should be, kind of going in the opposite direction. You should be trying to live as well as possible, not get close to the boundary, so to speak. But that was also just not very helpful to a lot of us. I think if you start off with completely different ideas of what too far might mean, and then you get a very kind of general answer like that, you tend to just kind of get cemented in your own misconceptions a little bit more, I think. So for someone like me, I tended to be very anxious and kind of scrupulous about things when I was younger. And I thought, okay, if I'm not supposed to be asking how far is too far and I'm not supposed to be pushing the boundary, then maybe I should go to the opposite extreme. Maybe the people who just touch each other as little as possible before they're married are actually the people who are chaste and they're living the holiest life. And maybe that's what we're striving for. And that's just not true. I've tried relationships in the past. Before my husband, I had at least one relationship where I would say the physical affection, it wasn't necessarily unchaste, and we weren't having sex, we weren't really even getting close to that, but it was just kind of out of balance. There was just a lot of physical affection very quickly, and that had its downsides. And then I had a relationship or two where there was almost no physical affection at all. We might have hugged a time or two, and that just didn't seem to work very well either. It wasn't really a well-rounded human relationship. It was, I think, just reinforcing kind of this scrupulous attitude that I had. And so that's a very simple kind of high-level background on kind of what I had run into and the advice I had heard. So I was very passionate about trying to delve deeper into the topic of chastity in the book and really get it right. So there was a lot of prayer over that chapter, exactly what to say and how to say it, and a lot of feedback from others, and just a lot of research on, what wisdom can we draw from not only scripture and tradition and the catechism, but the saints and other couples. I was able to speak to some married couples, especially newlyweds, and ask them, before you were married, what did you do or not do that you would recommend to others? What is your advice, kind of concretely? So I'm able to present in the chapter kind of the basic principles that we're starting from, what is the virtue of chastity and all of that, and then also get down into some pretty concrete, specific suggestions that aren't necessarily, commandments from God or laws from the church, but that tend to just be helpful and very practical for people. And I really wanted both to be in there, and I wanted to kind of get into those nitty-gritty details that other people aren't always so willing to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's super important because so it was funny about the how far is too far. Like as someone who's very scrupulous, I like to know how far is too far just so I know like what's safe within those boundaries, not necessarily because I
Right.
want to go ram up against them, but like okay, at what point is this like I have to go to confession and at what point is it like okay, maybe that wasn't a good idea. Let's try this. Like let's not go that far again, you know.
Right.
And
If
like
you're
where's the venial sin, where's the mortal sin? And so I love boundaries. I like laws. I like to know what's safe within and what's dangerous without. And I definitely relate to what you were saying that a lot of the dating advice for Catholics seems to be like, don't have sex. And then other than that, we don't quite know what to tell you, but also don't go too far. And so I've had priests that have been very helpful with it, but I know that I've had friends that I've talked to that are like, I've gone to different priests with this question, and some have had helpful advice, some have had absolutely no advice, and I had to kind of figure it out on my own. And I found your chapter when I was reading it through full of, like you said, the tangible, practical, here's some good guidelines. And also here's the like church teaching and concepts behind the practical advice that you had. So, what does the Catholic Church actually teach about chastity within relationships? Does it give any guidance of what's too far?
Yes and no. So there, other than safe sex for marriage, there's
Mhm.
no specific list of rules for what you can and can't do at every stage of a relationship. The church just doesn't get into the nitty gritty in that way. And I think there are a lot of really good reasons for that. It's similar to how the church approaches any other moral topic. The example I give in the book is the church will have a general principle like, you know, cultivate virtue in relation to food, for example, avoid gluttony. And gluttony is, these wrong attitudes toward food, and including like, just overeating, overindulging in food. But the church doesn't get specific and say, so this is the number of peanut butter sandwiches that someone should be able to eat in a day without committing gluttony, because that varies person to person, right? At what point you're just satisfying the needs of your body, and at what point you're overindulging is different. So similarly, the church kind of says, cultivate chastity, um, and be aware of not just kind of the external sins like fornication and adultery, but also just the internal sin of lusting after someone in your heart, which Jesus presents that to us in the gospel, and then kind of leaves it up to us exactly how we're going to cultivate that virtue and exactly the discernment of, did I lust in my heart after that person, or was that just healthy, normal attraction and desire? Or maybe was I tempted to lust after someone, but I didn't consent to that thought or that feeling, and I stopped myself in time by God's grace, and so I didn't actually sin, but maybe there's still improvement that could be made there. So there's a lot of just individual, I guess, prudence and discernment that we can have there, without being just totally relativistic either. So if you are maybe very sensitive, there might be certain physical gestures or certain situations that happen to be really tempting for you, and maybe you do start like thinking lustful thoughts. And so you have to be aware of that and know, okay, for me, that's not a situation I should put myself in again.
Mhm.
But for someone else, it just might not be tempting. Um, I used to be very, very sensitive to like certain types of scenes in movies and TV shows that didn't seem to bother other people at all. It would just kind of brush off of them. And I just had to admit, like, I guess I'm just weak in this area. I guess I'm just very sensitive for whatever reason. I'm going to choose not to watch that kind of thing anymore. But I'm not going to say that everybody I know who does watch it and seems unaffected is sinning as a result necessarily, you know. So different people are just kind of tempted by different things. And so that's why the church doesn't really list out like this is exactly when and how much you're allowed to kiss, for example. That also can be somewhat culturally dependent. You know, I married into a Mexican family where it's a completely normal greeting. You give everybody a hug and a kiss on the cheek when you're saying hello or goodbye. Whereas among a lot of, you know, non-Latino Americans, if you do that, that's kind of like, whoa, that's a lot, you know. And it might not be in a sexual or lustful way, but it's kind of, it just feels very intimate, right? And so different gestures actually mean something different in different situations as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I guess I more said what the church doesn't teach, but maybe that's helpful sometimes too. Because sometimes people will say, like, here's a bunch of rules, and it's not clear which ones are actually from God and which ones are kind of just suggestions that they're making up as a human.
And just to be clear too, because the church doesn't give this, it doesn't mean that anything goes before marriage as long as
Right,
you don't have
right.
sex. Like there is, like chastity is a virtue, but the tangible specifics, I guess, of like physically how far it is going to vary from person to person, basically.
To some extent, yes. But I would also say, again, this didn't come straight from the mouth of Holy Mother Church or from God. But as I was doing research for the book, I talked to couples and experts of various kinds, and there's some common sense, you know, guidelines that I think they all pretty much agreed on. Things like, okay, if it might not be sex, but if it really looks like foreplay, you should not be doing that either, you know, because what's the purpose? There's no sense doing all of XYZ if you're not going to, you know, continue into an actual active intercourse. And so I'm trying to keep this, you know, clean for the listeners, obviously, but uh, yeah, just things that clearly look like if this were being filmed, this would be considered very, you know, very steamy or very pornographic or something. If you're taking any clothes off that you shouldn't be taking off and touching certain areas of the body, like obviously that is going too far, and that's just common sense. There's also, I think, a pretty common theme that everyone has some line somewhere in the kissing and making out zone of things where they're starting to kind of get tempted toward either lustful thoughts or further actions. It just starts to become harder to control yourself. And so that's actually just a pretty normal way that our bodies respond. You know, it's normal to get pretty aroused if you're kissing someone a lot for a long period of time. And so um, everybody seems to pretty much agree. Everyone who's, you know, thinking about this issue pretty much agrees. There's somewhere in that territory where, with some self awareness, you can realize, all right, for me, this is the exact line where my switch kind of flips, and it's becoming too much for me. And that might vary a little bit person to person where exactly the line is, but a lot of people will just say, when it's no longer kissing and it turns into making out, whatever that phrase kind of means, then usually that's the line for most people, and you should probably stop there. But again, that's not quite as universal. So there's kind of, I think, steps of or different suggested boundaries that were pretty concrete that I was able to find that lots and lots of people agree on, and I think for good reasons, just based on how humans normally experience this situation. So it's definitely the case that even though the church doesn't list out these very specific things, we can kind of use some prudence and common sense and self-awareness and recognize there are certain things that you just they would be considered definitely kind of pushing the boundary or playing with fire too much, and there's just no reason to be doing that. But if you're, you know, holding hands or something like that, you are almost definitely very much in the safe zone, and there's nothing, you know, concerning or immoral about that. And there's kind of a spectrum in between each gesture, you know, of physical affection and even words and topics that we are talking about too are more or less intimate, and it's a matter of just kind of being a little cautious, a little prudent as you go into those things, and then being willing to stop and kind of dial it back as well, and say to the person you're dating, that got to be too much for me. Can we please not do that again?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my spiritual director told me that like the hard line, which again, it doesn't super help. Like it does help when you're scrupulous, but is like when it turns from love to lust. Like that's the like
Mm-hmm.
hard and fast. And like you said, the actual like physical amount leading up to that or the physical whatever like triggers that is going to be different for different people. But like when it comes to like the virtue of chastity, when you stop seeing like that person as a person and start seeing them as an object, like that's where the
Mm-hmm.
hard line is. And then yeah, the tangible ththings that it takes to get there are different.
And I think that could be hard. It sounds like we both have kind of dealt with scrupulosity, and this could be difficult. It can be hard to tell in the moment if you're loving or
Yeah.
lusting, or if you're thinking of someone as a person or an object. So, something that I like to share with people is that if it's all right to talk about arousal for a minute, I
Yeah.
think that's a big part of this topic that I think a lot of Christians are we're almost afraid to even say the word arousal. And if we're willing to just talk about that more concretely, I think it clarifies a lot of issues. So, what I kind of was able to glean from the research and experiences and everything that I pulled together is that, okay, arousal is not a sin. It is not a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. That's part of how God designed you. So, we don't need to be scrupulous and think, I got a little aroused. That means I'm in a state of mortal sin. I must be lusting after this person. This is terrible.
Mhm.
That's not true at all. But arousal is actually a signal that your body is preparing for something. Your body is thinking, oh, maybe sex is going to happen in the near future, because that's what arousal is for. So I think arousal is a good thing to pay attention to. If you realize that a certain thing typically does get you aroused, then you know that your body seems to think that a certain thing is about to happen whenever you do this thing. And so that's I think, a good signal that maybe your boundary for yourself should be a step before that. Whatever normally gets you aroused, just dialing it back one step from there. And again, communicating with the other person and saying, can we just draw the line over here and not quite go as far as we did before? Um, and that keeps you very much in the safe zone and kind of has this nice buffer before you get into the area of being too tempted, or kind of losing control of your thoughts or your actions in any way, and avoids kind of lying to your own body in a sense. If you're purposely getting yourself really aroused and then stopping it there over and over, that's just not um, truthful in a way, and it's not very healthy. So I think that, for me, kind of figuring that out, understanding that arousal is not a sin but a signal, and therefore I should be paying attention to it and considering making the boundary line right before the point where I'm actually starting to get aroused. That was really helpful for me to just discern, like, all right, these are my boundaries going forward, and now I know that I'm not in a state of sin or whatever. I know that I'm honoring the other person as well as myself. Um, and I think sometimes that gets missed in this conversation because I don't know. Again, we're just not willing to talk about it. Sometimes we're not willing to get that concrete, but that's kind of a nice line in the sand that I find helpful.
When I feel like people who are like struggling to understand the virtue of chastity, having like people talk clearly about it can be very helpful. Of like, okay, let me understand. Like you're talking about, like we talk about how it's different for different individuals, but then if you're not using the words to help that individual recognize how they're responding, that it makes it more challenging, especially if you're scrupulous. So yes, I do think that being able to talk concretely about how your bodies like respond to sexual like kissing and all of that, sexually respond. That's the word. Being able to talk about how your body sexually respond to physical contact in that way, like depending on what level of making out you're doing or kissing or whatever, can be very helpful in
Mhm.
being able to figure out your own body and your own self and like understand where your boundaries are for chastity.
Yeah.
I did not phrase that anywhere near as well as you did.
Oh, I think, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. There's also, I think, an aspect to it of, like, it's important to talk about this to affirm that arousal in itself is a good thing and it's
Mhm.
healthy and normal, and that we don't need to squelch that completely.
Mhm.
The goal shouldn't be try to, get through your entire life until your wedding night, never, never experiencing the slightest flicker of arousal, because that's probably just impossible for one thing. And it's also not, again, like feeling a little aroused does not mean that you've sinned. It means that your body is reacting to a stimulus. And
Mhm.
then you can decide, okay, so should I be introducing that stimulus purposely going forward, or is that going to be causing a problem and counteracting this virtue of chastity that I'm trying to develop?
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about the two vices opposed to virtue? Because I really liked that you talked about that in your book, and I liked that you talked about both of them, not just like anti-sex, pro-sex. Like it's chastity is in the middle. It's not just like no touch versus touch.
Right. So I think it's so easy to become either too scrupulous or too lax in the area of chastity because it's just such a sensitive area. We don't seem to struggle, most of us don't seem to struggle to the same degree with other virtues, but we know that for every virtue, there are two opposite vices. There's the excess and the defect, I think is how Thomas Aquinas puts it. There might be other terms for it, but you hear the phrase virtue is in the mean. And that means the middle, kind of between the two extremes. So chastity is the right attitude toward sex and sexual desire. It's properly ordered toward its real purpose. It's in right proportion to the rest of your life. So one way to think of it is your sexuality or your sexual desire is not meant to just blow out of proportion and take over your whole personality or take over your whole life or your whole relationship with another person. But it's also not supposed to be kind of shoved into a tiny little box that you set completely apart from your personality and try to ignore, because that's not integrating it within the person. The Catechism says sexual or chastity is. I should look up the exact phrase. It's
To find
beautiful.
it.
It's something like chastity is the successful integration of sexuality within the human person,
I
or
think that,
something like
yeah.
that, which I think is just so beautifully phrased. It's like it's a part of you that is good that you should embrace and not try to get rid of at all, but it's also not your whole self either. And you can choose to be celibate even for your entire life, and that doesn't, make you less of a person either.
Mhm.
Because sometimes in our culture today, it's like your sexuality, your what or whom you're attracted to, or what kind of things you like in that area becomes some people's whole identity, and that's not really right either. We need something in the middle. So yeah, there's no virtue necessarily in just completely swearing off all physical contact until the day of your wedding. Because again, that's just, it's not realistic for most people, and it's definitely not necessary to build chastity. Sometimes I think that people who sort of advocate for that are probably doing so out of fear of their sexual desire and fearing that any even just warm, fuzzy romantic feelings or any little flicker of attraction is, leading them into lust. And that would be kind of like deciding you're just gonna never eat at all or barely survive on bread and water rather than any temptation to perhaps become gluttonous. There are
Mhm.
very few people who are called to that life, right?
Or even
Um,
like I think you used the example in your book of like comparing how far is too far with like how much alcohol you're drinking. Like you could
yes,
swear off alcohol for your life, but you're not called to. God doesn't
right.
require that of you
Don't
to
have
avoid
to.
drunkenness or to avoid like um intemperance in that area. So learning how much you're actually able to have and enjoying it in moderation is like it applies to all sorts of other virtues. So it would apply here as
Mhm.
well.
Yeah, and one thing I kind of took that example from another wonderful. I guess he's not exactly an author. Well, Dr. Mario Sakaza, who he has this online course called Dating Well. He's a Catholic psychologist. I was just on his podcast as well. He's wonderful.
Cool.
He used that example of alcohol kind of in passing in one of his videos, and I thought, oh, that's perfect, and kind of elaborated on it because I think it's probably the best analogy. It's something where some people do get really extreme one way or the other. There are people who are see nothing wrong with getting super drunk all the time, and then there are people who because alcohol sometimes makes people act a little crazy or sometimes gets people drunk, they're so afraid of it that they're running to the opposite extreme when maybe they don't have to. And there are some people who do personally feel called to just not partake in alcohol, just like there are some people who personally have decided to remain celibate or take a long dating fast or whatever, and that's great. Um, yeah, and it also requires that same self-awareness.
Mhm.
You don't need to get absolutely plastered even once in your life to know what your alcohol limit is. Just like you don't have to go way too far even once in your life to know what your uh, physical affection boundaries should be. You can actually just take this carefully, step by step, and then notice if you're feeling the effects of the alcohol, a little too much, and go, all right, that's enough for me. I'm going to stop here. And it's the same with, again, just noticing how your body kind of responds to what you're doing with a significant other, and recognizing, all right, this is enough, and we can just stop here.
And I think also recognizing like God's grace. Like if you're actually trying to be chaste and at some point like you feel more aroused than maybe you should or something like that, just recognizing like that there is mercy and it's not like, oh my goodness, you just stumbled into mortal sin, but more of like you said, the like it's a signal, not a sin. And to be
Mm-hmm.
able to dial it back and draw new lines going forward to stay like within the quote unquote safe zone is really
Right.
important. And that not all like feelings are like the feelings themselves aren't sinful. It's when it starts like flipping in your brain and you're actively lusting after someone.
Right. In order to be in mortal sin, you have to make a willing choice of some sort, right? So if you just, depending on, especially as women, I think this can happen, like depending on what your hormones are doing that day, you might react to something way differently than you did last week and just all of a sudden be feeling a lot more aroused than usual. And you didn't, if you didn't choose that purposely and, pursue that feeling and continue encouraging it on purpose, then you haven't committed a mortal sin by any means. It would be sinful to continue encouraging that feeling and pursuing it and sort of testing the boundaries repeatedly, and or at least that would become very imprudent, right? So there's a difference in just how much did you choose this and consent to this thing that's happening in your mind and body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think it just goes back to like the feelings themselves aren't necessarily wrong, but like how you respond to them is like where
Mhm.
the right or wrong, like the decision, the choice, the will is where
Exactly.
that will lie.
Just like with anger, for example, too, you can feel angry and that could be actually a very healthy, normal feeling. Everyone needs to feel it in the right context, but then you choose how to respond to it. And um, that's depending on what you're actually angry about and how you react to it determines whether you've committed any sin or not.
Yeah. I actually have one of my friends used to say that she was like chastity before marriage is for the sake of chastity within marriage.
Mm,
Do you have any thoughts on that?
yeah. I think it's a huge I think clarification that often, again, just doesn't really get talked about as much that needs to be made, that chastity is not necessarily identical with celibacy. Chastity doesn't just mean avoiding sex. Um, so religious who take a vow of chastity, it is actually a vow of celibacy for them because they're not married, right? But chastity is also for marriage. And it ultimately means loving a person for the entirety of who they are, not just seeing them as an object for our own pleasure or sort of a prop for our fantasies, right? And so I think practicing that self control while you're still dating and engaged absolutely helps, have the same kind of self control and the same attitude toward the other person that you still need during marriage. It's just that what is allowed, so to speak, or what is the right action to do in this area has changed because now you are married. Your state of life has changed. Your level of commitment's different. So it's, I think, a really scary and kind of gross thought that I think a lot of people don't realize. Maybe they're thinking of this as just sort of rein in your desire, hold back as best you can until your wedding night, and then just go for it and anything goes. And that's not the case because then you'd be treating your spouse really horribly, probably, and not have a very healthy, fulfilling, well-rounded marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would also say for my husband and me, and I think for a lot of other couples, being able to communicate about our boundaries, talking about physical affection as we were approaching marriage and discerning marriage, and growing in chastity together as we sort of recognized where we had, slipped up a little or gone, kind of into the danger zone, and then we're able to talk about it and kind of redraw our boundary lines and then have self-control going forward. All of that meant that once we were married, we could communicate so much more easily and naturally about all kinds of potentially awkward things, that come up in marriage, but especially about, the area of sex and kind of how we're navigating that as something that was new for us, right? So I think that's a big part of it too. It gives you this practice of communicating well with the other person about what can be a very sensitive topic, and also just that self control where you're not like fleeing so far away from each other, sitting on opposite side of the room, kind of avoiding touching each other, and then just all of it at once, on your wedding night, which would probably be really overwhelming and terrifying. But you're looking at each stage of your relationship and kind of considering how do I express the level of love and affection I have for this person at this stage in a way that's appropriate. And then when you're married, it's a new stage and you have a different way to express your love and commitment to each other that you just didn't have before.
Exactly. Well, and also just like hugging is such a part of like all sorts of relationships that it'd be weird if you could do it with like friends and family and then you're dating someone and you're like, I can't touch you. Like that's
Right.
not a human relationship at that point. I mean, it is, but there's like, you hear that and there's something wrong there, that if it's okay to hug your like best friend, but you're afraid to touch your boyfriend, like maybe that's something you need to work through together and figure out like what's
Yes.
going on there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just because you're dating someone doesn't mean that all forms of touch that you have with that person are sexual, or they might not even be particularly romantic, because there's elements of friendship as well in your dating life. And as you're considering joining each other's families, you're about to become family, it makes sense that some of those gestures you use with your family, for example, become pretty normal in your dating relationship as well. And then there's also this layer of romance and discerning marriage. And I think it's very appropriate to have certain gestures that express that at the same time are not becoming overly sexual. There's something that can be kind of romantic and sweet and flirty, or all of that, without being in any way unchaste. I think that's important too.
Well, and even just like on a chemical level, it can help with bonding too,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of the dangers of it if you're getting into it too soon within a relationship. But at the same time, if you are growing in a relationship with someone you're going to marry, like we've had Dr. Joe Malone on this podcast multiple times talking about the like chemical bonding between men and women and how like unchastity actually like hurts that. But like having a healthy layer of physical affection can actually be very beneficial to helping a
Mm-hmm.
couple bond with each other. And so just recognizing like we're body soul composites. So like God has created us to be able to bond spiritually, but also bond physically. And that touch is a part of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you have any advice for people listening to this who are, I guess this was like talking a little bit about what is too far and what isn't is your advice, but any like thoughts for them of people who are listening who are trying to cultivate a virtue of chastity or in a dating relationship? Anything that could be helpful?
Sure. Um, yeah, it might be a little bit of repetition of what I said, but just to kind of lay it out really simply, I think the definite too far boundaries, which again, Dr. Mario Sakaza was helpful with this. There were others who kind of concurred and helped me kind of come to this conclusion. Um, it's very clear that, removing clothing or touching body parts that have to do with reproduction, basically, or the things your swimsuit has to cover, however you want to think about that. Like, we kind of know what that means, right? Like, touching the wrong places. Those things are definitely too far. Like, nobody should be doing that when they're not married and actively, like, probably in your bedroom, like, ready for sex, because that's just what those things are for. If you are, I think, I think for most people, if you're, pretty serious in the relationship, you're kind of discerning marriage, maybe engaged somewhere in kind of the later stages. I think most people are probably fine with just a simple kiss, even on the lips. There seems to be pretty universal concurrence that that's okay. some people find that, a little too tempting and too far, and that's okay. You could decide your boundary is to not do that until you're married. And I talked to a couple who chose to have that boundary, and they have no regrets, and they have a great marriage. But I don't think it's usually required. But I do think for most people, if you're, crossing over into the making out territory, that's where it's at least much more likely that most people are going to be experiencing arousal, and that it could at least be a temptation. And so I think a good kind of rule of thumb that a lot of people, a lot of the experts, so to speak, would recommend is like kissing fine, making out not fine. Again, you don't have to make it quite so black and white. There's probably going to be somebody listening to this who's like, I kind of make out with my boyfriend, and it's not tempting me, and it's fine. But I would just say maybe you're unusual. Maybe you're less sensitive. That's what, for most people, I think that's kind of the line where it starts to get too far. There's also this principle that I think John Paul II kind of articulates. He's very smart and very he writes in a way that I really struggle to understand, to be honest. But I read like summaries of JP2, and then I kind of understand what he's talking about. But he emphasizes that aside from just chastity itself, there's so much of just the way the body and soul work together. It's so important to only express with your body what you are also saying with your soul, and what's also actually true on a spiritual level. And so as part of that, he says, essentially, this is the way I kind of boil it down: physical affection should be the expression of an existing relationship, not the cause of your attachment. So that basically means it might not be unchaste for you to, say, kiss someone on the first date, but it also might just not be expressing a true relationship that's already there. If you really don't know this person very well, let's say you meet them online and you're just meeting up for coffee for the first time, and then, give them this like super romantic goodbye kiss. Like, is that a reflection of a true relationship that you actually have that's already built on other foundations, intellectual connection, emotional connection, all of that? Or is it just kind of, there could be a way to kind of want the pleasure of just a romantic gesture like that, not even sexual pleasure, but just kind of the thrill of it, and be kind of using the other person in a way, without it looking like sort of the normal, sins against chastity that we typically think of. So I do recommend thinking about, what gestures actually make sense when you're just starting to get to know someone. If you meet a new acquaintance and you would not even call them a friend yet, then maybe the most you're going to do is give them like a quick goodbye hug, right? And that lines up with what another expert that I was able to pull from this. There's a professor, Dr. Carrie Cronin. She was involved in the Dating Project documentary, if you know of that. Yeah. So when she talks to her college students about dating and kind of teaches them how to do it, she says in those first few dates, when you might even be going on dates with multiple people, you might be, whatever, you don't know this person very well, then you shouldn't be exchanging any saliva. You should be, at most just giving a quick hug, and that's it. And so that's a good example of thinking about, okay, where are we in this relationship, and how can I express that appropriately? And then when you're actually boyfriend and girlfriend, you're getting deeper into discerning marriage, there are all kinds of other really beautiful, sweet gestures that you can kind of introduce one by one, sort of as it's natural in the relationship. You can start holding hands. You can, kiss someone on the cheek. You can link arms while you're walking. There's, all kinds of things that I think sometimes we forget about, because the movies show us that as soon as two people like each other, they go straight to kissing, right? And
sometimes they go further.
Right, exactly. These days, yeah. And so, you don't have to go straight to kissing just because you're a little romantically interested in someone, right? You could choose to save that for later. And in fact, it seems like such a kind of close, intimate thing that I would say usually you should save it for later in the relationship, even if it's not causing you to be tempted to lust after someone. It's going to cause a lot of that kind of oxytocin rush and all those feelings that might kind of get in the way of laying the firmer foundation that you need in that relationship, and talking about the important things of actually considering whether you're a good fit for each other and all that. So hopefully that doesn't make people think that their dating life is just going to be super boring and unromantic. I found that mine was my relationship with my husband was very sweet and romantic, even though we actually didn't kiss on the lips until we were engaged. That was my request. Just that was the boundary I wanted to have based on prior experience. But leading up to that, we had lots of other forms of physical affection that were really nice and did help with making sure we had kind of the right level of bonding for each stage that we were in.
That makes sense. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. This has been a really good conversation. I hope it was helpful to our audience. I know that at least one woman on YouTube, or someone on YouTube, had asked in the comments for an episode on chastity. So when you had mentioned that you were interested in coming back on the podcast to talk about this, I got really excited. So thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you for having me back. Yeah, I hope it's helpful, and I know that based on what I wanted to know when I when I was younger and dating, I tried to provide that in the book, and I've tried to share a lot of that today. And then definitely when I go around and give talks to young adult groups and such, it's always the topic that people are most interested in, because there's just such I wouldn't say a lack of resources, but just sort of an incompleteness in the discussion sometimes. So I really hope this is helpful to the audience. I'm excited to hear what people have to say.
It seems like the best content always comes when you're like, I wish that this is something that I would have liked to know.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're able to like answer the questions that you had. Those always seem to be like the most like thorough. And if you want to know it, then other people also are asking those same questions. So
exactly. Yeah,
and
actually the whole book of all of Pretty Good Catholic is pretty much, this is the book I wish I'd had when I was 18 and was just kind of going out into the dating world, and I've tried to provide it for others. So
it was really funny. My mom actually sent it to me at one point. She's like, you should have this woman on your podcast. Also, you should read this book. I was like, thanks, Mom.
That's awesome.
But it was a very good book. Like I think I said this last time you were on the show too. Like I read through it and it's like such helpful tips. And I know that's been backed up by other people as well. And I will link it in the description so people can go check it out as if they want to purchase it. Definitely recommend it.
Awesome.
And to all of our listeners, please like, follow, and subscribe. Check out the new ebooks that we have coming out and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.